Hello, everyone, and once again, it's Andy Wilson for the Traveller in the Evening with our podcast. This time, I'm lucky enough to have with me Phil Smith, who's the author of a new book, Albion's Eco-Eerie, and a generally terribly interesting guy, but we're going to get into that soon. The two aspects of the meeting were a bit strange this time round. The first one was that I was extremely ill with a huge abscess on my face. We went ahead anyway. That in itself was not a problem, but I was improbably high on amoxicillin, and possibly that shone through. The second thing is that my relationship to Phil's work was slightly strange in as much as I really enjoyed his book, but what it made me think of was all the background to it in hauntology and in the kind of stuff that came out of, I guess, Mark Fisher and people around and around Mark, and of that what I think of as the occupied generation. That wasn't Phil's job. Phil was there to talk about his book, and hopefully we did that. But I kind of wanted to get that stuff out, and I think we did. I really enjoyed the discussion with Phil, and it turned out that we both had that we had a similar political background, which we were able to use as a sort of concrete thing around which we could have some of the discussions about, particularly about the Ghost of Marx. So I really enjoyed the discussion, and thanks for Phil for letting me do it.
Andy, I feel like I'm playing as a fullback in rugby union, and rather than the fly half kick a high ball, you've just kicked about 17 high balls, and I've somehow got to gather them up. I probably that's probably going to be beyond me. So forgive me if I just pick up the odd one or two and try and run with it. So I'm someone who's very interested in ideas and theories, but I'm not really a theorist. I'm not a philosopher. I had the great privilege recently of actually sitting down with a proper professional philosopher the other day, and that was a wonderful experience. Partly because he was prepared to sort of verify or at least take seriously some of the ideas that I was putting forward. But I was also very aware that he has a rigor and a tradition and a kind of process, all of which I lack. So I've never studied philosophy properly. I've never had that education, so I'm very much coming to it as in a sort of DIY way. Most of it picked up in small political groups with a range of different opinions, and together kind of exploring stuff, and then on my own, and then with colleagues in academia, outside of academia, talking theory to each other as, sort of an exchange, and a lot of talking ideas with people as walking through landscapes or terrains that are informing those discussions. So what I'm going to try and explain is a bit of a paradox, which is that to some degree, I'm not that interested in the ideas, but at the same time, I'm aware that an idea is behind my lack of complete faith in the ideas. So there is a kind of materialist thing going on here, where what I'm really kind of basing stuff on is what I see happening in history, in the world, in the ecology, and that's what I'm bouncing off all the time. So in a rather ill-disciplined way, I'm sort of grabbing ideas to try to explain what the hell is going on. Yeah.
Oh, I want to say, Phil, that regarding this business of, deep philosophy, and, I realised in framing the whole meeting, I'm setting impossibly high bar. Nobody could explain all that. If you wanted to explain the philosophy of Mark Fisher, you'd have to explain the philosophy of Nick Land first, I think, and nobody can explain that. So I'm not really looking for you to explain it and paint the big picture, you'll be happy to hear. And I am much more comfortable with your kind of thing. I really, actually, really like the sound of how you just described the kicking the ideas around and kind of using the ideas. And that's cool by me because that still really helps me understand how those ideas are used and reflects back at them. So maybe if you just want to kick into sort of, I suppose, leading up to and then saying something about your book, we can then dig into that to where it brings those reflections out.
Yeah. So, so my particular take, I think, on those ideas, including the work of Nick Land, is to try to understand the historical situation. So I think we have some common background in a presence and an activism in on the what as you described it, the hard left in British politics. And part of the theory, depending on which bit of the kind of Trotskyist spectrum you were on, but part of the theory was an understanding that either so if we're talking about the kind of the 80s, um, uh, the Soviet Union was either some kind of deformed or I can't remember the terminology now, but sort of a worker state, yes, but it's gone horribly wrong. Or it was no, it's not. It's never been a worker state. It's state capitalist. It's just another. It's an authoritarian and centrally organized version of capitalism, and its priority is the accumulation of capital. It's just that it doesn't have a stock market, and it has a sort of nomenclatura rather than a ruling class of people. So you've got that, and I would have subscribed to that idea. Even quite a long time after I'd sort of departed from the actual practical side of that politics.
Would you have subscribed to it from the point of view of the Socialist Party or the Socialist Workers' Party or some other group?
SWP. So that would be that would be my orientation at that time. So
where were you? Sorry, which branch?
Bristol.
I was in the SWP in the 80s. I was the Liverpool organiser for a couple of years, but I'd never spoken in Bristol. So, but if I had, we probably would have met.
Yeah. So,
sorry, carry on.
So the way that kind of politics worked, I think, was that there was there was always this sense that some kind of revolutionary change was always just about to happen. And you talked about this imminent sort of push. People could make very convincing arguments, and one could convince oneself that this was the situation. There was a sort of thing where inside every strike it is a kind of germ of revolution. And that's what your job was as an activist, was to pour water, so to speak, on that germ, and to get it to fully flower. And so every tiny outburst of resistance or change or whatever was a sign that a much greater change was going on. And I think that argument could be made in a reasonably respectable way. I mean, people who stood outside it would criticize it and say you're forever leaping from one thing to another, grasping onto the last bit of hope, and so on. And that frenetic energy is what is keeping everybody going. I mean, those arguments are familiar to anybody who's been in been in those organizations and been criticized for being in them. But for me, I think the feeling that I eventually came to, partly from visiting some of those, visiting Russia, visiting Eastern Europe, while it was just on the cusp, really. I think I first went to Eastern Europe literally the week after the Berlin Wall fell down, or was pushed down. And then visited Russia in 90 and 91. So there, it wasn't that radically different to what it had been years before, except that the kind of superficial. Well, no, it wasn't superficial if they were after you, but the kind of some of the state apparatuses were kind of withering or turning out to be transparent. The but the So from those experiences and from simply like watching the international scene, my feeling is that that whatever analysis you make of the Russian Revolution, the changes that occur as a result of that, and whatever, the project of communism or socialism, that project failed, utterly failed, and the horror that one has to confront is not that there is some burning ember that one can pluck from the wreckage, but that the wreckage is ultimate, it is complete, and therefore the reclamation is not a possibility. And I think so much thinking is based on the idea that even if in its negative form, which I think is where Nick Land is going to, is that he's actually constructing a kind of anti-communism, a kind of communism of dark matter or negative matter or whatever. But it's still a kind of reclamation of that radicalism. And for me, what the last sort of, I don't know, 10 years or more have been about, or maybe 20 years actually, have been about sort of trying to rethink what on earth one does in the face of the complete and utter failure of the project to which one has committed oneself. And so, although I certainly don't count myself as an activist, but I will occasionally sort of turn out for a demonstration about this, that, and the other, to give my support, against the right-wing rioters, or to protest the privatization of bits of Dartmoor, or join in with Extinction Rebellion on a march or something. I kind of, but my feeling of that is I'm doing that with no hope whatsoever. That I want to give support to that, but I don't now feel that is going to be part of a greater movement, that these things are going to draw together, and as a result of collective action there will be some radical change. And just to finish that point, the reason why I think that is the case is that the forces that could make that radical change have been and are progressively being dismantled, so that the collective organizations that were still sort of there in the 1980s are barely there at all now, and certainly don't have the kind of collective glue that would, or coherence that would allow them to, for example, take on the forces of a capitalist state.
You've blown my entire meeting out of the water, really, Phil, because the premise was that I was going to be this complete naif while you fill me in about the details, of the sort of Occupy, I guess, 90s and beyond left. But you're talking about stuff I'm deeply familiar with and very passionate about. I was a state capitalist in the SWP myself. I was expelled on philosophical grounds. I thought that one of the interesting things in my just beginning to learn a bit about Mark Fisher was that he was at school during the miners' strike. Well, I joined the SWP in the miners' strike, and to me it proved absolutely that workers in struggle change. I was sent, when I was at university, I was sent by the SWP to intervene in the Pontefract branch. So I went there also. I left one of my finals exams half an hour early to catch the train to go to Pontefract to be with the miners there, right? So I had this very positive view of the working class, albeit that their spine was shattered by Thatcher, and I don't need to tell you about that. But nevertheless, I experienced real labourism, and that was such a positive experience. Even though labourism has gone, punk rock changed my life. Even though the Sex Pistols broke up many years ago, so it's so important to me, that experience. And I guess a lot of that generation never had it. They're all post-miners strike, so they're really warm feelings about workerism, but they don't know what it is. So you end up with acid communism becoming acid Corbynism and all this fucking middle of the road semi-Stalinist nonsense wheeled out, and and putting lipstick on the turkey, a sort of psychedelic lipstick on the turkey, by talking about acid communism. Even my friends in the AMM, Ben Watson, out to lunch and his mates, started talking about Jizzer Corbyn, Jizzer, right? Orgasm. This wildly electrifying feel-good. That's fucking nonsense. But let me say to you, Phil, before we go on, because I could talk to this about this forever. I'm deeply interested in what you say. I was a state capitalist, and I have to say that I thought the best thing Cliff ever wrote was the final chapter of his book on state capitalism in Russia, when he describes how it would collapse. And anyone who can predict what is going to happen, that means you're onto something, right? And I'm no longer really a Marxist. How can you not be an immense fan of Marx? But I think calling yourself a Marxist is bullshit, because nobody can prove to me that any particular brand of Marxism is right. None of them one against the other, and they're all completely different, and they're all trying to deny that this philosophy of praxis, in which what happens is what counts. It don't really matter what happened to Marxism, it's all just a series of errors. So I just think it's a dead tradition in that sense, albeit that there's much wonderful value. I kind of wonder how we want to do the rest of the meeting. I'd love to talk more about this mainstream stuff, but I really want to make sure we get into the. I want to talk about Night of the Demon. It's one of the most important films I ever saw.
Where I think the bridge is that even if. So there's a sort of paradoxical thing going on in the thinking of people like Mark Fisher, which is that they've sort of accepted the characterization that I just gave, really. But at the same time, they want to keep the ghost alive. They want to keep this, so Derrida, the beginnings of hauntology is Derrida writing this book, Spectres of Marx, which he's writing in response to Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, that the battle between capitalism and communism, between left and right, has been resolved. The right has won. Neoliberalism will continue indefinitely. And so he comes back at this and he says, well, even if the political reality of communism will never be realized, that the spectre of Marx will still hang around. It will still be relevant. Yes. It will still be relevant to the crises that will occur within capitalism. And sure enough, post 1989, it was not a smooth ride for capitalism. That there were economic crises that were quite extreme, affected lots of people's lives in a really negative way, and there were very serious wars, so there wasn't a sort of stabilization period. And the hope that places like Russia would start to look more like America didn't happen. So and yet, or maybe and because, and so these two things are happening. There is but yet and because the spectre, the hauntology, which is penetrating, which is not just an artistic artifact. So Derrida's play on words is a study of ghosts, hauntology, and ontology, which sounds almost the same thing in French, sounds almost like the same word. Those two things. So it's actually that there is a spectral quality to being itself, to existence itself, within this particular moment of capitalist development.
let me get this right. You were talking about that. What is the spectre? And you were saying it's in the nature of being itself. Now, when I think about that spectre, I didn't know what Derrida meant. I didn't know what Nick Land or anyone else means by it at all. But what I kind of imagined was that it must have something to do with what I experience as the collapse of my world. And what I mean by that is that the world, speaking prosaically, right, an old guy like me, can remember. I remember driving across the Pennines one night, listening to an interview. I was on a work car, I was on a visit to somewhere, but it was night time. And there was an interview with the group Lindisfarne. And one of the things they said really caught my attention, which is that we are the generation who never went to war. We never had to go to war. And that's strange. And you can say, well, the Falklands, I was thrown out during the Falklands War, by the way, of the Navy. So you can say, well, there was the Falklands War, or there was, Korea, or this, that, that. But for most people, when they ended conscription, if you weren't dirt poor, the only reason to join the military would have been because you liked that kind of thing, right? Right, okay. Most people, it didn't have to bother you. If you're people like you and me, bohemians. Another day I'll tell a story of why I was in the Navy, but that's a different thing. So it really struck me, yeah, we are that generation. That's a very kind of thing. In a similar way, I assume that for every setback, like Thatcher, in some sense, we still live in the Enlightenment. And Alex Kalinikos, who's now the head honcho of the SWP, formerly my philosophy professor at York University, but Alex Kalinikos liked to say that really Marxism is the continuation of the Enlightenment, right? This continuation of the Enlightenment. And there's a sense, actually, that is true. I think he's right about that. He's right about a few things, occasionally. But yeah, he's right about that. But that's ended because that enlightenment has gone. I don't feel it. I literally, it's like the bottom has fallen out of my world, and it's fallen out that kind of liberal world of progress and the idea of social progress, despite setbacks, is somehow being guaranteed. If you had said to me when we were both SWP members that there's no guarantee of victory, I'd have said, of course there isn't, you fucking idiot. But like all of us, I think actually there was a kind of, the bend of history turns in our direction kind of feeling. History has removed the bending and the...
We were living with the ghost, even though we would deny determinism. It's not determined. The conditions do not determine an inevitable turn in that way. There was the ghost of that assumption, which was that something would happen. And I think that's where there's resonance, or that's if you like, the dark shadow behind the hauntology, that the spectre throws a shadow, which it shouldn't do, but it does, and that so the spectre is that actual determinism of the spirit, so to speak, rather than the words themselves. So although there was a philosophical refutation of the idea of determinism and the idea that change was not determined, there was, if you like, a spirit, what Raymond Williams would call a structure of feeling, that was there within that skepticism. So there was that. I mean, I always really kind of bristled at the suggestion that this stuff was related to religion. But because I don't think that the similarities, there are more dissimilarities than similarities, but there was in this respect an element of faith within, and that continues to throw this dark shadow. So I think one can understand the work of someone like Mark Fisher in terms of the complete and utter failure of the project.
Viewers, listeners, it's an anarchist Christian hat that I consider to be both trendier and more attractive than my old Marxist hat, but certainly more radical. Okay, but my Blakean Christian take on this, I think the spirit there that should be there is the Holy Spirit, which is really about solidarity. Nothing else is solidarity. So it seems to me that you can experience Marx's ghost, this hauntology, as the spirit of Marx, either haunting events or casting a shadow over them, or the absence of the Holy Spirit. The absence of the spirit where we operate on solidarity rather than some sense of a teleology of history in which the bad people are the conservatives. That's the past. The progressives are the future. That's why we call ourselves progressives, because we believe in progress, whatever that means. Do we believe it exists? Do we believe it has to happen? But it's essentially a teleological thing in which we're pointing that way and they're pointing that way, and that seems to be the whole Marxist thing is tied up with that historiography, right? So that was my first thought there, but I want to say to you, right? You're going to come in and answer that lot in a second, but after that, feel free to move on to my second point, which is, your book is about the Eco-Eerie. Can you talk about that and how it relates to these issues and what the book sets out to do? It's a fun book. It's a really, really nice book. If you could make as many mistakes as you liked in that book, and I would have enjoyed it because, you talk about films like, Night of the Demon, which, it's such an awesome thing just to think about, So your book couldn't fail, but I just want to get a better sense from you of what holes it's trying to fill or whatever.
Yeah. So to address the first part of that, I'm actually going to end up answering the second part. So I think my trajectory has been very different to the one that you've been on, and I think partly the position of William Blake might be fundamental to that difference. So there are some writers that I just don't know how to connect to. So a lot of the people that I interact with on social media are great readers of Blake, that feel great affinity with Blake and with Blake's ideas, and I can think of another writer, which is Alan Garner, who I don't deal with in the Eco-Eerie, another writer that I can't. I personally just don't. I find it difficult to make a connection to. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's just that I haven't put in enough time or whatever. So I think some of that might be around that, but there is, I think, a more fundamental difference, which is, and I'll address it in terms of spirit. So you reeled off a list of titans, elves, goblins, or whatever, and I think you possibly threw in ghosts and spectres in there, and I think these are really separate, so, or at least they represent something that's very different. So so my orientation is not towards the spectre or the spirit, but towards the material. So I've stuck. Yeah. My ontology is still to do with materialism, and in the same way as I'm skeptical of, even though I think the ideas are really useful, I'm skeptical of the sort of the base of that whole hauntology world, because I think there is a material catastrophe that sits behind it, which all the time threatens to make it worthless. But the positive side of that is then to go to the places of catastrophe. So I spend a lot of time, particularly with my colleague Helen, as part of our Crab and Bee performance art making project. And we spend a lot of time visiting like the spoil heaps of the old mines arsenic, copper, tin, silver, around the sort of the banks of the Tamar, or go on to Dartmoor, which most people, I think, particularly any kind of day tripper or tourist person, thinks of as a bleak but beautiful natural place, whereas in fact it's been ravaged for literally tens of centuries, or tens of thousands of years, actually, by the processes of deforestation, and mining, lots and lots of tin mining up there. So it's a post-industrial space, that, and so it's not a Holy Spirit that that I attend to now, but a set of unholy goblins, pixies, elves that manifest in it as spoil heaps, weird feelings on the moor and around the mines, as streams and rivers that run out of control and sweep the banks away. So that's where my shift has been. So although I'll often express it as through the personalities of those things, which might be a goblin or whatever, what I'm talking about all the time are the metals, the minerals, the rocks, the soils, the trees, the thorns, and so on.
Oh, that's really amazing. That's such a lovely description of what you're doing. I would ask you in a minute to tell us a little bit more about those activities and what, your performances. I did all of the Crab and Bee book, and I was kind of hoping it would have arrived by today, so we could talk about it a bit more. But again, it'd be cool if you said a bit more about that. But that stuff about, up on the moors, that sounds absolutely fascinating. But in terms of this, there's no need to get into it. But in terms of this materialism kind of question, I mean, I've written about how, Titans are just old gods who were defeated by a newer generation of gods, and they're always put in abeyance, like, the serpent of Midgard, or, the Ouroboros. The chaos dragon has to be banished. Those gods have to be banished and kept at bay. But then they return when chaos, the chaos returns at the end of history at Ragnarok. And it just strikes me that that's a very kind of close analogue of what's happening with our climate, right? And so old gods are arising, old things, old ideas, things that are alien to us. And they're my goblins, titans, whatever they are. I just mean all that stuff, like fairies. When you abolish the old gods, do you still fear them? Yeah, okay. Bury them under a mountain, dude, because they're going to blow their top, right? Do you still fear them? Or these ones? No. Okay, they can live under a little fairy mound and be pleasant people that we're acquainted with. But it's the same idea. And I use Blake's spirit in that sense as a corollary, or maybe a negative image, or I don't know what the relation is, but a similar kind of idea as the ghost of Marx. But I think the Holy Spirit is a real thing, and I've seen it. Like, talking about it as spirit doesn't mean it's not real. We may differ on some boring ontological point, but it's there. Just as the Ghost of Marx can be said to be there. I just wondered if one of them wasn't sort of an expression of the absence of the other, which seemed, whatever. But then, but the main thing was just, again, more on the Eco-Eerie, because to me, it's something is eerie. Maybe we can talk about, I don't know, one of the films you discuss, and one of the things, maybe not Night of the Demon, but whatever, in this context, which is things are eerie just because they're fucking weird, right? The map has changed, everything has changed. I feel a bit dizzy and sick. That's why they're eerie. And I wondered, does that make us more interested in things that represented eeriness to us in the past? Is more familiar. Not everybody, a few people I know, quite a few people I know, have taken up mycology. They love the idea that mushrooms are thinking under the ground, and, the sheldrakes and all this kind of thing. I love it. It's amazing. But we've all come to this sense that nature's really fucking weird, just as the point at which we're getting battered by it. They seem to be obviously deeply related, but I'd like to ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think part of the attraction of of the fungi is that they're so connective, and that that it's only really relatively recently that, as we've begun to experience what you've been describing, which is this fragmentation, this collapse of things that we might previously have seen as being firm, fundamental, things like the ground beneath our feet, things like the nation, things like Britain, that the things are breaking up, things like class. What class are you now? And if you're in that class, does it exist anymore? Those kind of experiences of this sort of breaking up. Then to come to some kind of grasp of the idea of the wood wide web and these mycorrhizal kind of threads of communication and the sharing of nutrients seems to provide an alternative to that. And you'll see it in the philosophy of perhaps the recent philosophical thinking of people like Donna Haraway, Anna Leeuwenhoek-Singh, people like that. But it's also then in some earlier thinking. So one of the kind of contemporaries of Deleuze and Guattari is a guy called Fernand Deligny, who worked as a psychologist, therapist, worked with people with autism. And he was very much about this. He called it arachneism. So it was about webs. It was about people making journeys within spaces and then tracing those journeys and making connection through journeying. And so I think that's kind of why your friends are getting interested in mushrooms. It's not the single mushroom itself, but it's an alternative to that, what you were describing as solidarity, so that you can't form a revolutionary party with a philosophical ideology with a bunch of mushrooms. All that you can do is pay attention to them. And I think, yeah.
Everything you're saying about this, the wood wide web, I've heard that before, but it's nice to be reminded of the expression. That everything you're saying about that, I absolutely concur with. But I do think that the big attraction to my friends is just that the idea. I mean, I've always thought it's odd that we take psilocybins, right? And this network is producing this thing which affects, they say, affects the thinking of an ant, so the ant doesn't eat the mushroom. Some crazy. It's got to be bullshit, right? This thing that we think might be able to think is producing chemicals that make it trip. Now that might be nonsense. Okay, I might just be doing some, hippie whatever here. I don't care. I quite enjoy it. But the point is that the thought of that is really weird and alien. I think you'll know more about this than me, but in Fisher's book about the eerie and the weird and all that, is it the eerie that one of them he characterises as the presence or the absence of subjectivity, or the unexpected presence of subjectivity, or the unexpected absence. And again, I cannot but help but think of a hyper object, right? Global warming, is it present? Well, there were heavy rains last week, yeah, but they were caused by what's happening down the. At what point is global warming? Well, it's real, but utterly impalpable. This is very like the experience of a bizarre presence or absence of an unexpected, peculiar, discombobulating, unexpected absence or presence of an active force. Yep. And when I talk about subjectivity, I'm a reader of Bateson. Right? I have a very loose idea, and I'm a kind of panpsychist. I have a very loose idea about what a spirit is, or psychology, or a person, or a being. They're all spilling into each other, and I'm perfectly happy to grant something. I'm happy to describe global warming in terms that are analogous to spirits or subjectivities or things. So I'm cool with all that. But my point is that, so the weird and the eerie seems related to the hyper-object business. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I think that is a very positive way, a very positive take. I think so. So I think the rekindling of an interest in this material to some degree reflects people's anxieties, and then behind the anxiety is the desire for climate change. I think that there's something very appealing about climate change, as well as something very terrifying. If if the wildfire is sweeping up to the edge of your home, or if the river has burst its banks and is sweeping your motor car away, or whatever, particularly if you're inside it. So there is a terror. But there is also, I think, a desire. It's
You mean a fascination with death, kind of thing, or a kind of, a sense of the spectacle? This is it. Finally, we get to experience the full power of the everything is going to go. Whatever. Is it that kind of thing you mean?
I think it's partly that. It's not just death, it's also chaos. So I mean, death is a sort of chaos in the sense that your body breaks down and redistributes itself. So I suppose that is what happens in a chaotic state. So I think that is part of the desire that's going on, and therefore, sort of looking at there's something quite comforting in a way at looking at old movies of huge vegetable monsters bursting out of metal domes, as happens in Quatermass 2, because we're kind of thinking, well, that's what's going on at the moment. That our the metal dome that we've attempted to place over over other agents, is falling apart, and these things are bursting through. And if you're watching it in the form of a 1950s kind of sci-fi Hammer Studios monochrome movie, then it's pretty safe. It doesn't. It looks like a world that you sort of partly recognize. I mean, we grew up at similar sort of times, so we remember that rather monochrome 1950s going on 1960s, kind of bleeding into the early 70s. We remember that kind of slightly monochrome British society that was around at the time. So we might identify to some degree with those images, but at the same time, then you aren't horrified, or you aren't terrorized by. There's a Gothic distinction, wasn't there, between horror and terror? So horror was just making people feel really unpleasant and attacked, and that was I think that was horror, and terror was this much more sort of meditative understanding of the strange and the weird. I think Anne Radcliffe, the early Gothic writer, was making that distinction and saying that people think Matthew Lewis's The Monk was just horrific, whereas what she was trying to do was bring a reader to terror, which was a more positive sort of thing, and I think those two things still are around. So if we watch a movie which is like a slasher movie, which in a big cinema where we're kind of drawn in, and we get these complete continual jump scares, which I really don't like, where some figure kind of moves in from the corner of the screen and makes you jump back. That's very different to the terror of contemplating these monstrous forms that are bursting through industrial ones, and in many ways that is uplifting in a way that that a slasher movie is not. So it's not dwelling in and celebrating nastiness. It's actually celebrating and dwelling in a more than human energy or material presence, or whatever you want to call it, hyper object. Timothy Morton might well call it, and it's attending to that thing. So the book, the Eco-Eerie book, with Cormac Pentecost's Temporal Boundary Press, the idea of that in a way is to take that more contemplative enjoyment of these artifacts, and then then encourage people to use that pleasure to then transfer that within, to keep that pleasure, but to transfer it into attendance on the actual material monsters that are out there and are lurking, or and that we live with all the time. Some of them are tiny or quite small things that, you know, that are resting in the trees next to the house, sort of thing, and or burrowing around in the ground in the garden. And some of them are really kind of absolutely immense things, which might be the mycorrhizal systems, or might be, you know, these immense storms that are now regularly sweeping across, certainly across Britain at the moment. So these are, you know, and to attend to them in the same way as you were saying, you know, go to the picket line, show solidarity, show support, give what you can in terms of material assistance, but you don't have to recruit everybody to your own idea of how change works, but you support the change that's already going on. And so I think that's where I've kind of got to, and that's what the kind of that's what the book, if you saw the book in instrumental terms, as well as hopefully an enjoyable thing in itself, then it's towards encouraging people to make that connection with those real monsters.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, Phil, because it's not what I would have predicted to say, but it directly analogous and connected with what I thought was going on, which is more or less this. Let's take this framework. Say we are colliding with a hyper object. Everything is weird. There are many people who deny that. Deny, you know, climate change deniers, people like that, right? They don't even see this fucking thing because it is weird as fuck. Learning to see weird things is going to be a valuable skill in the transition between worlds during Ragnarok, so to say. So I always thought that the Quatermass experiment about the Martians at Hobbs Lane or whatever it was, utterly terrified me because, you know, cutting out all the details here for the moment, what the story it tells is that underneath human society is something deeply unpleasant imported from Mars and injected into us, which we never knew was there, and bang, here it is. Do you know what? Not a bad analogy for the Trump election and the consequences of that. That looks a lot like the fucking, you know. So the seeing the strange and the eerie is really practically useful. And I kind of guess that the point of getting used to the idea of mushrooms are, you know, nature in the form of fungi under the ground are sort of thinking and doing weird shit and can cure everything and all this great stuff. It's preparation for understanding that life is not what you thought it was, which is exactly where we are, because it isn't what we thought it was. The Enlightenment collapsed, Marxism collapsed. We are in a very strange place, and we need the tools to, not just to think about it, you know, they probably already exist, but we need the tools to be able to experience it and feel our way through it. And I think this stuff is really valuable to that. Can I invite you to say a little bit more about the book, just about what else is in it and what you talk about, and a quick rundown? Just, I think our listeners, promised, you know, an interview with you about your book, probably getting quite angry that I haven't let you talk that much about it. It's him, he's not talking about it, guys, right? That's what's happening. No, God, you know, feel free, Phil.
Well, I'm in very many ways. I'm heartened by the way the conversation has gone, because I'm not really. I mean, if people want to find out what's in the book, they need to go and get the book and read the book. So to me, it's much better that we take things from the book and then explore them more. Because I mean, certainly for me personally, I'm learning much more by this conversation than I am simply by recounting what I've already thought and written down. But in terms of what's in the book, so it takes a series of I'm not sure that there are a series, a congregation of little artifacts, movies. I'm not sure when the earliest one is. The Maze is the earliest one, which is, I think, made in the 1950s, early 50s, I think. All the way up to the movie The Girl with All the Gifts, which is a sort of zombie movie, but it's not real. I mean, there are sort of zombie-like aspects to the main character, Melanie, I think her name is, and but it's really about this kind of vegetable transformation of humans into kind of a hybrid species. And so what I was looking at, so yeah, to wind the tape back a little bit, I became aware that there were a number of sort of movies and TV programs that I'd been either affected by because I saw them when I was fairly young, as either as a child or a teenager, or came to them later on and sort of enjoyed them, that were being sort of corralled in two forms. One was is something we've already discussed quite a lot, which is this hauntological kind of theory and take on culture. But the other thing was was folk horror and the folk horror revival, and so you get the Things Strange book by Adam Scovell. I'm not sure how you pronounce Adam's name, but Scovell or Scoville, in which he, following Mark Gatiss, kind of defines these movies in terms of these, I think, 3 or 4 principles, which were around things like social isolation, some kind of moral kind of moving from the path, so to speak, and whatever. And to me, it just sounded like kind of urban prejudice is against kind of country people, you know. And you kind of go, well, I'm not convinced that the moral culture of the city is superior to the moral culture of rural life, and in fact, I think, particularly if you're living in England or in Britain, it's often very difficult to see that there's any difference between city and countryside, that the countryside is so, that the agriculture is so mechanized, it's so organized, it's so industrialized, that there's a real continuity, I think,
sorry, Phil. My wife says that I don't have ideas. I just have stories that I tell over and over again, and they're really just things that happened to me that had a profound impact on me. And one of them is that 25, maybe 30 years ago, my brother was driving me across the south of England. We were going through, a kind of agricultural area, and I was reading a book in the back of the car, and he turned around and got really shirty with me. Look all around you, Andy, at the joys, the beauty of nature. There's all these totally stripped hills, completely industrial agriculture with massive warehouses. It's like an aircraft factory out there. But that is perceived as nature, and it just blew my mind. I had to sit and listen to him, witter away at me because, sorry, Phil, I'm not saying, but I had to listen to you tell me off because our wives are there and they're all agreeing. It's shocking, that you don't respect nature. And ball back to you. I just want to say that because it's such a big thing for me.
So these landscapes are abject landscapes, and they're landscapes that are deeply traumatized and have been scoured and scraped, and you've only got to walk down a Cornish lane, as I was doing 2 or 3 days ago, and all the hedgerows have been flailed back. So I mean, fortunately, they've done it in winter rather than at the time when all the chicks are hatching. But quite often, they've just devastated the nesting birds by that, and you see that, and on one level you can see that as a bucolic scene, but on another it is a scene of species devastation, and that is the nature of a lot of the countryside, and and at the same time within the city, in the granite gutters, forget-me-nots are starting to push their way up through those gutters, and that poses the question to us then: are these forget-me-nots a little tiny flowering of something that will fairly quickly go away, or are the granite gutters a very brief presence which will eventually be replaced by the meadow that was there before and is the meadow to come? And that for me, and that's quite an eerie feeling, because it's about something that's absent when it should be present. But also, what it does is it allows in, by attending to that little clump of forget-me-nots, and seeing that actually it's now starting to sort of spread all the way up the side of the street, that by attending to that you're beginning to unpeel the apparently solid quality of our contemporary experience, and allow in something that's much more kind of riotous and much more chaotic in its form of organization, and the forget-me-not, although it appears very frail and vulnerable, it is part of that, what Morton calls a hyper object. It's relating, it's paying attention to these vast associations of more than human entities and agents that we spend a lot of our time trying to corral. The tree in the city centre that's got a whole lot of concrete all around it, desperately kind of isolating it. That we can only hold those things back for a limited period of time, and just to kind of roll out the full vision, so to speak. So in terms of the energies that I've been trying to write about in Albion's Eco-Eerie, the energies which are kind of being heralded in those movies, I think if you put those things together, what you're seeing is the emergence of a planet B. So the great slogan of the green movement is "There is no planet B." My response to that is, yes, there is a planet B, and it is the planet B of the forget-me-not. It's the planet B of the thriving jellyfish in acidifying oceans. It's the planet B of these extraordinary flood waters. Terrifying for human beings, so exciting for water. I mean, water is, for water. Acidifying oceans are horrific for mollusks, but fantastic for jellyfish. And so this idea that we can say, oh, there isn't going to be a planet B, that is just simply continuing the human hubris which has got us into this horror. And we need to accept, I think, that, and indeed celebrate the fact that a hybrid mutant planet is going to come into being, and that we need to settle ourselves into a much quieter, a much less bossy role within that planet. We're going to be a very, very minor species, and it's going to be quite frightening because we won't be top predator anymore. So there will be things that will be trying to eat us, and it will be much bigger than us, and we will have stopped killing. But I think that's, for me, that's how to relate to a hyper object, and it's sort of pushing at that or hinting at that, which is what the Eco-Eerie book is about.
Man, you've we're going to have another meeting about Planet B now. I thought you were at first. I thought you were talking about oh, we don't matter. The Earth is all right without us. It's like, then what's the point of solidarity, right? It's if you don't matter, I'm not going to show you. So we all matter. So I just love to hear you talk about that, and it was so brilliant today to listen to you talk about a lot of things, but particularly when you were representing that vision. It's so moving and interesting. I have to say that our time is kind of up, and not only that, in the last 24 hours, I've begun to get some knowledge of the timing of taking painkillers versus taking amoxicillin, because when you take the amoxicillin, about an hour later, you're getting a massive rush of pain as it attacks the abscess further and it's swelling up. That's where I am at this very point in time. And even if I take a couple of painkillers, it's not going to get better that quickly. So I'm kind of going that way. I've had such a fantastic time talking to you, Philip. It was such a pleasure. I didn't know what to expect. We're acquaintances online. We both know the, what was Cormac's press. He used to do that Coil fanzine, and then he does that Albion thing he does. And we also both know Dan Sumption is producing your Crab and Bee thing. So we kind of know each other and been around, and I read your book, and I'm not a complete idiot, so I have some idea of what you thought, but it's still a mystery to me about how that was all put together. And I did learn a lot about the whole Fisher thing and the occupied generation. I learned a lot of real interest. I have a lot more to learn, I get that, but you've given me some really good orientation kind of things. So I really, really enjoyed your book. You made a useful distinction there between the performative and the enjoyable aspects of it. It really works on both levels, especially when, if you're my age and you're reading about films. Reading about films that you know and love, like Night of the Demon or that Quatermass episode, or even the one that I forgot the name of that you discussed a minute ago, which I haven't seen, but your description and discussion of it was absolutely fascinating. I just forgot the name. So it was a great read, and really everyone should get it. Whatever you think about how we've kind of dealt with these issues today. So I really want to thank you, Phil, for spending time with us today. I will say what I always say at these events, which is that wherever you're listening to this podcast, because you can get it on Apple Podcasts, it's syndicated, as us technologists say. Wherever you get it, please visit thetravellerintheevening.com or Traveller in the Evening at Linktree. Come to the site, because where the podcast is hosted on the site, which is its kind of base, if you know what I mean, there'll be supporting materials, including some images, more details about Phil's books, ISBN numbers, links to where you can buy them, and whatever I think that will be useful for you. But possibly even more importantly than that, you can also subscribe to the Traveller in the Evening, and then when we've got podcasts and new articles, you'll know about it. I've had people unsubscribe. I can't believe it, really, because I very rarely send out an email. It's once every few weeks I get an email saying, here's a new article. But some people don't like that. I really don't understand it. But come and subscribe, and you'll get those occasional emails, and that'd be great. And if you're not, if you can afford it, become a paid subscriber. You don't get anything as a paid subscriber as a matter of right, but probably if you mailed me and said, you know what, Andy, send me digital copies of all the books Ancan did, and you're a paid subscriber, I'm going to do that for you. But I think people should pay just because it's a cool and useful site, and I don't live off it at the moment. I'm retired, but it helps pay for some of the maintenance costs of the tech and things like that. So if you want to make a donation or make a paid subscription, please do so. But just subscribe anyway. You don't have to pay anything.